During Sunday dinner, my son-in-law James handed me his phone under the table with a text that said, "Dad, check your retirement account right now, then pretend you are having chest pains and leave." I looked at him in shock, but I decided to trust him and do exactly what he said. 10 minutes later, I was clutching my chest and knocking over my water glass while my own son rolled his eyes at my supposed medical emergency. He had no idea I had just seen the $850,000 wire transfer draining my life savings. Before I tell you how I dismantled his perfect life completely, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that blood does not give anyone the right to steal your dignity. The dining room in Cameron and Vanessa's house was a masterpiece of modern suburban luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the long mahogany table, illuminating the expensive roast beef and the gleaming silver cutlery. I sat at the head of the table, a 71-year-old retired structural engineer, quietly chewing my food and observing the life I had built for them. I recognized the granite countertops in the open kitchen because I had written the check for the down payment on this house 5 years ago. I recognized the expensive imported leather chairs we were sitting on because I had purchased them as an anniversary gift for the couple just last year. Outside in the driveway sat Vanessa's brand new luxury sport utility vehicle, a vehicle I had co-signed and heavily subsidized to ensure my future grandchildren would ride in safety. I had spent my entire adult life climbing steel frameworks, inspecting concrete foundations in freezing rain and saving every spare dollar, so my son would never know the financial anxiety I grew up with. Now, as I sat eating the dinner they had prepared, I listened to my daughter-in-law Vanessa deliver a thinly veiled, deeply condescending speech about my declining competence. Vanessa took a delicate sip of her red wine and leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the table. She looked at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes and began talking about how enormous and empty my historic home must feel to me now. She spoke to me using the slow, exaggerated tone one might use to address a confused child. She suggested that maintaining a 4-bedroom property was simply too much physical and mental strain for a man of my advanced age. She casually mentioned that she had been researching several highly rated managed care facilities that featured wonderful assisted living programs and round-the-clock medical supervision. Every word she spoke was designed to strip away my autonomy and frame me as a frail, incompetent burden who needed to be quietly relocated and managed. I looked across the table at my son Cameron, expecting him to defend me. Cameron simply continued cutting his roast beef, chewing methodically, and staring at his plate in silent agreement. He did not meet my gaze. My daughter Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly disturbed by the conversation, but too intimidated by her brother's dominant personality to cause a scene. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, a profound grief for my late wife, who had always believed family dinners should be filled with warmth and gratitude, not calculated insults. I swallowed my pride, offering a polite but non-committal nod to Vanessa, determined to keep the peace for the sake of the family. It was in that exact moment of quiet humiliation that the evening fractured completely. James, my usually quiet and unassuming son-in-law, who sat directly across from me, suddenly shifted his posture. James rarely spoke during these dinners, often overshadowed by Cameron's booming confidence and Vanessa's sharp tongue. He reached for his cloth napkin, and under the cover of the heavy mahogany table I felt a hard, cold rectangle press against my knee. I glanced down discreetly and saw James pushing his smartphone into my hand. The screen was illuminated and unlocked. I looked up at James, expecting to see a joke or a funny picture meant to break the tension. Instead, I saw a terrifying intensity in his eyes. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, and he gave me a nearly imperceptible nod toward the screen. I lowered my gaze back to my lap, angling the phone so only I could see it. The text message glowing on the screen was incredibly specific and entirely terrifying. It read, "Dad, check your retirement account right now. Then pretend you are having chest pains and leave." My heart skipped a painful beat. My engineering background had trained me to respond to sudden crises with cold logic rather than panic. but the sheer absurdity of the instruction paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. Why would James, a man who minded his own business and worked quietly in corporate information technology, demand I check my bank account in the middle of a family dinner? I looked back at James. He stared at me with an unblinking urgency that sent a chill straight down my spine. The air in the dining room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Above the table, Vanessa was still talking brightly about the amenities at a luxury retirement home, oblivious to the silent emergency unfolding directly beneath her expensive plates. I knew James was not a man prone to dramatics. If he was telling me to fake a medical emergency to escape this house, the foundation of my life was actively collapsing. I slipped my own phone out of my jacket pocket, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, hiding the device behind my napkin. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed my thumb against the biometric sensor of my phone to unlock my mobile banking application. The screen loaded, revealing the dashboard of my primary trust account. This was the account that held my entire life savings, my pension payouts, and the substantial life insurance settlement from when my wife passed away. It was the financial fortress I had spent 4 decades building to ensure I would never be a burden to anyone and to guarantee a legacy for my children. The numbers populated on the screen, and the breath completely vanished from my lungs. The total available balance, which yesterday had sat comfortably near $1 million, was virtually gone. In its place was a glaring red notification indicating a pending outbound wire transfer. The amount being drained from my account was exactly $850,000. I stared at the screen, my mind violently rejecting the numbers my eyes were processing. $850,000. It was not a mistake. It was not a bank error. The transfer details listed an external escrow account that I did not recognize. The sheer scale of the theft was catastrophic. A cold, heavy dread settled into my stomach as I realized the mechanics of what was happening. A wire transfer of that magnitude required in-person authorization, multiple layers of identity verification, and signatures. I had not authorized anything. I slowly raised my head and looked directly at my son. Cameron was wiping his mouth with a napkin, laughing at a joke his wife had just made. He looked completely relaxed, entirely comfortable in the house I had helped buy, eating the food I had indirectly paid for. He was sitting there, enjoying a Sunday roast, while simultaneously executing the financial assassination of his own father. The betrayal was so absolute, so flawlessly cruel, that it felt like a physical knife twisting between my ribs. He was stealing everything I had ever worked for, and Vanessa's speech about moving me into a care facility suddenly made horrific sense. They were not planning to care for me. They were planning to take my money and lock me away where I could not fight back. The grief that washed over me lasted only a few seconds. The sorrow of losing the son I thought I knew was instantly incinerated by a sudden freezing surge of pure adrenaline. I was a structural engineer. When a building begins to collapse, you do not stand inside and weep over the broken beams. You identify the structural failure, you evacuate, and you prepare for demolition. I realized that confronting Cameron right now in his own home would be a fatal mistake. If I screamed, if I demanded my money back, he would know the trap had been spotted. He would have time to finalize the theft, hide the money, and claim I was having a senile episode. I needed to get out of this house immediately to intercept the transfer, and I needed to do it without raising a single suspicion that I knew what they had done. I remembered James's text message. I needed an extraction plan, and a medical emergency was the perfect, undeniable cover. I waited for Vanessa to finish her sentence about the beautiful gardens at the assisted living facility. Then I let my face go completely slack. I drew in a sharp, ragged breath, making the sound loud enough to cut through the quiet dining room. I brought my right hand up, clutching the left side of my chest, gripping the fabric of my shirt tightly. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a low, agonizing groan. To sell the illusion entirely, I leaned heavily to my right, allowing my forearm to sweep across the table. My wrist caught the heavy crystal water glass, sending it crashing to the hardwood floor, where it shattered into dozens of pieces. The sharp noise of the breaking glass acted like a gunshot in the room. Melissa screamed my name, instantly leaping from her chair and rushing to my side. James was on his feet, a split second later, playing his part perfectly, grabbing my shoulders and asking if I could breathe. I kept my eyes half closed, maintaining the heavy, labored breathing of a man in the midst of a cardiac event. I peeked through my eyelashes to observe Cameron and Vanessa. Their reaction was the final piece of evidence I needed to permanently sever my emotional ties to them. My son did not look terrified. He did not rush to hold my hand or ask if I was dying. Cameron stood up slowly, looking down at the spilled water and broken glass with an expression of profound irritation. He let out a long, dramatic sigh. He actually muttered under his breath, complaining that I had ruined the dinner and stained the expensive rug. Vanessa stood behind him, her arms crossed, looking at me not with concern, but with cold calculation, perhaps wondering if my sudden death would simply expedite their acquisition of my wealth. James did not give them time to react further. He loudly announced that we were not waiting for an ambulance. He grabbed my coat from the back of the chair, hauled me to my feet, and threw my arm over his shoulder. Melissa was crying, grabbing her purse and demanding to come with us. James firmly told Cameron and Vanessa to stay behind and clean up, promising to call them the second we reached the emergency room. We moved quickly through the hallway and out the front door. The moment the cold night air hit my face, the heavy oak door of my son's house clicked shut behind us. I stopped dragging my feet. I stood up perfectly straight, pulling my arm away from James's shoulder. The fake pain was gone, replaced by a cold, silent rage. The illusion of my family was dead, and I had exactly 36 hours to hunt down my stolen life savings and bury my son's future in the wreckage of his own greed. James navigated the quiet suburban streets with aggressive precision, while the heater in his sedan blasted warm air against my cold hands. In the back seat, Melissa was crying softly and clutching her cell phone repeatedly, asking if she should call ahead to the emergency room. I kept my eyes closed for the first few miles, listening to the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt. The physical pain I had manufactured was entirely gone, but the heavy weight of the $850,000 theft sat firmly in my chest. As we crossed the city limits, I opened my eyes. James did not take the highway entrance ramp that led to the regional hospital. Instead, he took a sharp right turn, guiding the car into the vast and entirely deserted parking lot of a local grocery store that had closed hours ago. He parked under a solitary sodium street lamp and shifted the transmission into park. The engine idled quietly in the dark lot. Melissa leaned forward between the front seats, her voice trembling with confusion as she asked James why we were stopping when I was clearly having a massive heart attack. I slowly unbuckled my seatbelt, rolled my shoulders back, and turned to face my daughter. I spoke in a completely calm and steady voice, assuring her that my heart was perfectly fine and that I was not experiencing any medical emergency whatsoever. Melissa stared at me in the dim light, her tear-streaked face twisting from profound worry to utter shock. I reached back and gently squeezed her hand, explaining that the chest pain was a necessary illusion to get us out of that dining room without triggering a massive confrontation. I told her that if I had stayed in that house for one more minute, I might have done something unforgivable. I watched her process the sudden shift in reality, realizing her husband and her father had just coordinated a silent escape from her brother's home. James turned off the ignition, plunging the interior of the car into total silence. The only sound was the faint sound of the wind outside the glass. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring straight ahead at the dark brick wall of the grocery store. I asked him to explain exactly what he had seen that prompted him to send me that terrifying text message under the dinner table. James took a deep breath, his knuckles turning white against the leather wheel. and began to recount the events of the past 30 minutes. He explained that just before the roast beef was served, he had excused himself to go to the kitchen to fetch a pitcher of ice water. The kitchen had been empty, but the overhead lights were dimmed, leaving the space illuminated only by the glowing screen of Vanessa's tablet computer, which had been left carelessly unattended on the granite island counter. James told us that he had walked over to the counter to grab the water pitcher and happened to glance down at the glowing screen. He said he would normally never invade someone else's privacy, but the bright red numbers on the banking interface caught his attention immediately because the logo at the top of the screen matched the exact regional bank where I had kept my primary accounts for 40 years. He stepped closer to the tablet and recognized my full legal name prominently displayed at the top of an active user portal. Vanessa had not just left a web page open, she had left my secure banking dashboard fully authenticated and active on her device. James described feeling a cold spike of dread as he read the confirmation page. He realized Vanessa and Cameron were actively manipulating my financial assets, while sitting just 15 feet away, complaining about my supposed mental decline. The details James provided next confirmed the absolute worst of my fears. He explicitly saw the $850,000 figure listed under a section labeled Scheduled Outbound Wire Transfers. The status was marked as pending verification. James explained that his background in corporate data security immediately kicked in. He knew that if he walked into the dining room and confronted them directly, Cameron would simply close the browser, deny everything, and claim James was snooping and misinterpreting a routine financial review. They would gaslight him and rush the transfer through the moment we left. James realized the only way to protect my assets was to alert me silently, allowing me to witness the theft with my own eyes, and then force an immediate evacuation so we could strategize. His quick thinking had given us the one advantage they did not anticipate, which was the element of total surprise. I absorbed James's explanation in the cold silence of the vehicle. There was no time to panic or lament the betrayal. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my leather wallet. My fingers were stiff from the chill, but I managed to slide out my primary bank debit card. I held it up to the dim glow of the street lamp filtering through the windshield and squinted to read the 24-hour fraud hotline printed on the back. Melissa asked what I was doing, her voice barely a whisper in the dark. I told her I was stopping the bleeding before the patient bled out completely. I typed the toll-free number into my phone and pressed the speaker button so both James and Melissa could hear the conversation. The automated ringing echoed loudly in the confined space of the sedan. Every second that passed felt like an hour. I was a man used to controlling my environment, building structures that could withstand hurricanes and earthquakes. But in that moment, sitting in a deserted parking lot, my entire financial foundation felt as fragile as glass. An automated voice prompted me through several security menus before finally connecting me to a live representative in the fraud division. A young man named Brian answered, his tone polite and distinctly bored, customary for a Sunday night shift. I did not raise my voice or show my panic. I spoke with the exact same authoritative, measured tone I used when instructing steelworkers on a high-rise construction site. I provided my full legal name, my social security number, and my mother's maiden name to bypass the security protocols quickly. I told Brian I was looking at my online dashboard and seeing a pending outbound wire transfer for $850,000. I stated clearly and firmly that this transfer was completely unauthorized, fraudulent, and needed to be frozen immediately. I heard the frantic clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line as Brian accessed my file. James leaned closer to the phone, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen. Melissa held her breath. The typing stopped. A heavy, uncomfortable silence stretched over the speakerphone. When Brian finally spoke again, his bored tone was entirely gone, replaced by a cautious, highly trained customer service cadence. He cleared his throat and explained that he saw the pending wire transfer in the system. However, he told me he could not flag the transaction as unauthorized or place an immediate freeze on the account. I felt a sharp spike of anger and demanded to know why my own bank would refuse to stop the theft of my life savings when the account holder was explicitly reporting a crime. Brian remained infuriatingly calm. He explained that according to the system logs, the wire transfer had not been initiated through a remote hack or an anonymous online portal. It had been executed legally in person at a physical bank branch on Friday afternoon. I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing. I told him that was impossible because I had spent my entire Friday afternoon at the community center playing chess nowhere near a bank. Brian sighed softly through the speaker. He explained that I did not need to be present at the branch for the transaction to be legally executed. The representative stated that the individual who walked into the branch and authorized the massive withdrawal had provided government-issued identification and fully authenticated legal documentation. My stomach dropped as I anticipated the next sentence. Brian read from his screen stating that the transfer was authorized by my designated legal representative. He read the name aloud. It was my son. Brian explained that my son had presented a comprehensive, notarized, durable power of attorney document. This legal instrument granted him absolute unrestricted access to my financial portfolio, allowing him to bypass my direct authorization and move my money wherever he saw fit. The bank had processed the paperwork, verified the notary stamp, and accepted the transfer request exactly as the law required them to do. The words hung in the cold air of the car like a death sentence. A durable power of attorney. I had never drafted such a document. I had never signed my legal autonomy away to anyone, especially not to a man who complained about having to help me clean my gutters. The sheer scale of the betrayal expanded exponentially in my mind. This was not a spontaneous crime of opportunity. This was not my son simply stealing my banking password and transferring funds on a whim. This was a calculated, premeditated, and highly coordinated legal conspiracy. To execute this, Cameron would have needed a lawyer to draft the fraudulent paperwork, a willing accomplice to forge my signature, and a corrupt notary to stamp the document as legitimate. He had spent weeks, perhaps months, building an invisible legal trap right beneath my feet. He did not just want to rob me. He had systematically stripped away my legal rights, reducing me to a silent spectator in my own life. I looked at Melissa, who was covering her mouth in sheer horror, and I knew that the son I had raised was officially dead. I forced myself to breathe evenly, despite the sudden constriction in my chest. I did not let Brian hear the devastation in my voice. I asked him a very specific question, demanding to know the exact physical location of my money at this precise second. Brian hesitated, likely intimidated by the absolute lack of panic in my tone. I reminded him that until a court proved otherwise, I was still the primary account holder, and I had a federal right to know the routing status of my funds. Brian typed a few more commands into his system. He explained that because my son had authorized the transfer late on Friday afternoon, specifically at 4:45, the transaction had narrowly missed the final domestic clearing window for the business week. The money had been pulled from my primary trust, but it had not yet been fully deposited into the receiving institution. It was currently sitting in a digital purgatory known as a weekend holding queue. It was a temporary structural delay, a tiny flaw in Cameron's otherwise perfect design, and it was the only lifeline I had left. The relief I felt was sharp but incredibly brief. I asked Brian to simply cancel the hold and reverse the funds back into my trust immediately. Brian let out another heavy sigh and explained the harsh reality of banking regulations. He told me that a weekend holding queue is not a cancellation window. It is simply an automated pause dictated by the Federal Reserve operating hours. Because the transaction was authenticated in person with a legally binding power of attorney, the bank's automated systems considered the money already spent. The funds were locked in a transitional server waiting for the federal networks to reopen on Monday morning. Brian stated that from a purely administrative standpoint, his hands were entirely tied. He could not unilaterally reverse a verified wire transfer based on a phone call, especially when the legal documentation on file explicitly stripped me of my own authority to challenge my son's financial decisions. I was effectively locked out of my own life savings by a piece of paper I had never seen, trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare designed to protect the very person robbing me. I pressed him further, asking for the exact details of the receiving institution. If my money was moving to a local bank across town, I could easily walk in with a lawyer on Monday morning and freeze the receiving account before Cameron could withdraw the cash. I asked Brian to read the routing information aloud. The typing resumed, followed by a long, terrible pause that made the air in the car feel suffocatingly thick. When Brian spoke, his voice carried a genuine note of sympathy for the first time during our entire conversation. He informed me that the destination was not a local branch or even a domestic corporate bank. The $850,000 was being routed to an international corporate escrow account based in the Cayman Islands. My son had not just opened a new checking account to hide the stolen funds. He had set up an offshore financial fortress. Brian explained that international wire transfers involve multiple intermediary banks, and once the funds cleared the domestic network and crossed international borders, they would be completely outside the jurisdiction of United States financial regulations. Brian laid out the nightmare scenario with absolute clarity, dismantling any lingering hope that this would be a simple fix. He explained that if the money successfully landed in that offshore escrow account, my own bank would have zero authority to pull it back. The money would effectively cease to exist on American soil. I would be forced to hire international asset recovery lawyers, navigate completely foreign legal systems, and spend years fighting a battle I could not afford to wage simply to recover a fraction of my own wealth. I asked him for the exact timeline. I needed to know the precise moment the digital gates would open and my life savings would vanish forever. Brian checked the clearing schedules. He told me that Monday would be consumed by the initial processing through the central banking hubs. The final international clearance, the moment the money became permanently untouchable, was scheduled for exactly 9 a.m. on Tuesday. That was the absolute deadline. If I did not legally intercept the transfer before that exact minute, the financial foundation I had spent 40 years building would be gone permanently, leaving me entirely dependent on the mercy of the son who had just ruined me. The mathematics of the situation crystallized in my mind with terrifying precision. I looked at the digital clock glowing brightly on the dashboard of James's car. It was 9 o'clock on Sunday night. I had exactly 36 hours to dismantle a sophisticated, legally fortified conspiracy that my son had likely spent months engineering in secret. I asked Brian what I needed to do to stop the transfer legally. He told me that a phone call was useless. To halt a verified international wire, I had to physically walk into my main branch before the Tuesday deadline and present either a signed federal court injunction or the original physically revoked power of attorney documents bearing a new notary seal. It was an impossibly high mountain to climb in a single business day. I thanked Brian for his honesty and ended the call. The car was silent again. Melissa was staring at me, her eyes wide with fear, realizing her brother was trying to leave me penniless and defenseless. I looked at James. The shock had completely evaporated from my system. I had 36 hours. It was time to go to war. I placed the phone back into my pocket and stared out through the windshield at the empty grocery store parking lot. For a fleeting moment, a wave of profound sorrow threatened to pull me under. I remembered teaching Cameron how to ride a bicycle in our old driveway. I remembered working 60-hour weeks at the engineering firm just to ensure his college tuition was paid in full so he would never graduate with a mountain of debt. I had spent 4 decades laying down a solid foundation for him to build his life upon. But the boy I remembered was an illusion that had just been completely shattered by a forged signature on a durable legal document. The pain of the ultimate betrayal was agonizing, but I refused to let it consume me. Grief is a luxury you can only afford when you are safe and right now I was standing in the middle of a financial war zone. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the cold air, and allowed the forgiving father inside me to die so the ruthless engineer could take over. Beside me in the back seat, Melissa began to sob uncontrollably. She leaned against my shoulder and desperately tried to find a logical excuse for her brother. She stammered out theories that perhaps Cameron had made a terrible investment and was just borrowing the money temporarily to save his own house. She wanted to believe that this was an act of quiet desperation rather than malicious theft. I wrapped my arm around her shaking shoulders, but I did not offer her any false comfort or empty promises. I spoke softly but firmly, telling her that desperate men ask their families for help, but absolute thieves forge legal documents in secret. I explained the anatomy of the crime to her. Cameron had not just taken cash from a safe. He had orchestrated a complex legal maneuver designed to strip me of my constitutional rights and leave me completely helpless. He had looked me in the eye at the dinner table and complained about my advanced age while actively finalizing my total financial ruin. There was no innocent misunderstanding to clear up, and there was absolutely no redemption left for him to claim. As the final traces of denial evaporated from the confined space of the car, a profound and chilling clarity settled over my mind. I completely stopped looking at Cameron as my flesh and blood. Instead, I viewed him exactly as I would view a critical structural failure in a massive high-rise building. He was a catastrophic flaw that threatened to bring down the entire legacy I had spent my entire life constructing. In structural engineering, you do not negotiate with gravity, and you do not show mercy to a failing support beam. You isolate the damage and you aggressively dismantle the compromised sections before they destroy the entire framework. Cameron had arrogantly assumed that my age made me weak, and that my unconditional love for him made me blind. He was counting on me to panic, to call him crying, or to waste precious time confronting him emotionally without a strategy. He did not realize that by intentionally severing the sacred bond between us, he had completely freed me from any obligation to protect him from the devastating consequences of his own actions. I leaned forward and placed my hand on James's shoulder. The young man who had sat quietly in the shadows of my son's arrogance for years had just saved my entire future. I looked him directly in the eye and thanked him for having the extraordinary courage to warn me under the table. Then I laid out the harsh reality of our immediate situation. We had exactly 36 hours before the $850,000 disappeared into an untouchable international offshore account. I told James to start the car and put the vehicle in drive. We were not going back to my house to rest, and we were certainly not calling Cameron to demand an explanation. Tomorrow morning, the second the doors opened, we were going to walk into the main branch of my bank and demand the physical copies of the forged documents. We needed to identify exactly who had notarized that fake paperwork, and we needed to find the specific legal loophole that would allow us to rip the floor completely out from under my son. The time for being a loving father was officially over. It was time to show Cameron exactly what happens when you try to demolish a building that is heavily fortified. The sun had barely crested the horizon on Monday morning when James pulled his sedan into the parking lot of my local bank branch. I had not slept a single minute, but I did not feel fatigued. I was wearing my best tailored charcoal suit, the exact same suit I used to wear when negotiating $50 million municipal construction contracts. I was not going to walk into that building looking like a confused elderly man who had misplaced his checkbook. I was walking in as a senior structural engineer who was about to conduct a highly aggressive audit of a catastrophic failure. James walked quietly beside me in his own dark suit, acting as my silent witness and technical advisor. We pushed through the heavy glass doors the exact second the security guard unlocked them at 9 o'clock sharp. The bank was quiet, smelling of fresh coffee and lemon floor cleaner, with tellers just beginning to organize their stations. We did not stop at the customer service line, and we did not take a number from the plastic dispenser. I walked purposefully past the waiting area and headed directly for the large glass corner office belonging to the branch manager. His name was Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man in a cheap tie who had enthusiastically shaken my hand for years whenever I deposited my substantial pension checks. I opened his heavy glass door without knocking and stepped inside with James closing the door firmly behind us to seal off the room. Mr. Thompson looked up from his computer monitor, his polite customer service smile freezing on his face when he registered the cold, unblinking expression I was directing at him. He started to stand up, offering a nervous greeting and asking how he could help me on such a beautiful Monday morning. I did not return his greeting, and I did not accept the chair he gestured toward. I placed both of my hands flat on the polished wood of his desk, leaning forward just enough to invade his personal space and establish absolute physical dominance in the room. I kept my voice dangerously low, speaking with the measured, terrifying calm of a man who held all the cards. I told Mr. Thompson that on Friday afternoon, his branch had authorized an $850,000 wire transfer out of my primary trust account. I informed him that I was not present for this transaction. I had never authorized this transaction, and the funds were currently sitting in a weekend holding queue bound for an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Mr. Thompson swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward his computer screen. He nervously stammered that the transfer had been completely verified through a legally binding durable power of attorney presented by my son, and therefore the bank had acted entirely within its legal rights. He tried to sound authoritative, attempting to build a bureaucratic wall to hide behind, completely unaware that he was trying to stonewall a man who had spent 40 years dismantling concrete walls for a living. I did not raise my voice, but I let the full weight of my corporate experience crush his weak defense. I explained to him that in my professional career I had managed commercial engineering projects with budgets larger than the total asset holdings of his entire regional branch. I told him I knew exactly how corporate liability functioned, and I knew the difference between a thorough verification process and negligent rubber stamping. I leaned closer and informed him that the document his staff had accepted on Friday was a complete and absolute forgery. I told him that if he did not immediately produce the physical copy of that power of attorney for my inspection, I would not just close my accounts. I promised him that by noon, I would have a team of federal banking regulators and my own corporate litigators standing in his lobby, and I would hold him personally liable for facilitating a massive wire fraud against a senior citizen. The color drained completely from Mr. Thompson's face. He looked at me, then looked at James, who was standing silently by the door with his arms crossed. The manager realized he was not dealing with a confused old man who could be easily dismissed with bank policy jargon. He was dealing with a highly educated, deeply angry professional who was entirely willing to destroy his career. The branch manager did not argue anymore. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his mouse and rapidly clicked through his administrative portal. He unlocked his desk drawer, pulled out a physical key, and walked over to the secure filing cabinet in the corner of his office. He frantically flipped through a stack of thick manila folders until he found the one bearing my last name. He pulled out a small stack of stapled papers and placed them on the desk between us, stepping back as if the documents were physically burning. I picked up the heavy legal paperwork. The top page declared itself a durable power of attorney, granting my son Cameron absolute and unconditional control over my entire estate, my medical decisions, and my financial portfolio. I flipped to the signature page. There, resting on the dotted line, was a nearly flawless imitation of my own handwriting. Cameron had clearly spent hours practicing the precise loops and sharp angles of my signature until he could reproduce it well enough to fool a complacent bank teller. I stared at the forged ink, feeling a sickening knot form in my stomach as the tactile reality of my son's crime finally settled into my hands. This piece of paper was the weapon he had used to completely erase my autonomy. But as I looked closer at the bottom of the page, my eyes locked onto the official raised seal and the black ink signature of the notary public who had certified this fraudulent document. I had my evidence and I had my first target. I held the heavy paper up to the bright fluorescent lights of the office. The forgery of my signature was a remarkably good piece of visual deception, but my entire professional life had been built on finding the hidden flaws in seemingly perfect structures. I ignored the blue ink of my stolen name and shifted my focus to the bottom right corner of the page. There, pressed firmly into the thick parchment, was the raised circular seal of a registered notary public. In the state legal system, a notary is the ultimate gatekeeper of truth. They are legally sworn to verify the physical identity of the person signing a document of this magnitude. For this piece of paper to be accepted by the banking system, a licensed professional had to look my son in the eye, ask for my physical identification, and consciously choose to commit a severe federal crime by stamping a lie. I ran my thumb over the raised bumps of the official seal, feeling the physical evidence of my own erasure. I leaned closer to the paper because I needed a name. James stepped away from the heavy office door and walked over to stand right beside me. He leaned down, narrowing his eyes as he read the tiny black text printed directly beneath the embossed seal. He read the name out loud in the quiet room. Patricia Lawson. The name did not immediately register in my mind. I did not know a Patricia Lawson. I assumed Cameron had simply found a corrupt professional online or bribed a desperate stranger in a strip mall office to legitimize his theft. But James did not step back. He kept staring at the name on the paper, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. I watched his face shift from analytical focus to a sudden sickening realization. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and rapidly tapped the screen, opening a social media application. He typed the name into the search bar, his fingers moving with frantic precision as he scrolled through a timeline of photographs. A few seconds later, James turned the screen of his phone toward me. Displayed on the bright glass was a photograph from a lavish holiday party hosted at Cameron and Vanessa's house just a few months ago. Standing right next to my daughter-in-law, holding a glass of expensive champagne and smiling broadly for the camera, was a blonde woman. The caption below the photo, written by Vanessa herself, read, "Celebrating the holidays with my absolute best friend in the world, Patricia Lawson." The air in the branch manager's office suddenly felt incredibly cold. Patricia was not a random corrupt official working in a dark alley. She was a licensed real estate notary who also happened to be Vanessa's closest confidant. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind, forming a picture far more sinister than a simple son stealing from his father in a moment of panic. The sheer scale of the betrayal expanded in my chest, like a dark, suffocating cloud. This was not a crime of opportunity committed by a desperate child who had made a bad investment. This was a highly coordinated multi-person conspiracy. Cameron had not acted alone. Vanessa, the woman who had sat at my table last night pretending to care about my health while plotting to put me in a nursing home, was an active architect of the fraud. She had recruited her best friend to provide the legal authentication required to bypass the bank's strict security protocols. They had sat together, likely drinking wine in the very kitchen I had paid for, and casually stamped away my life savings, my autonomy, and my entire future. They had formed a criminal syndicate within my own family. The realization stripped away any lingering ounce of mercy I might have held. I was no longer dealing with a misguided son. I was dealing with a hostile organization that needed to be completely dismantled brick by brick. I looked back down at the terrified branch manager. He was practically shrinking into his expensive leather chair, desperately hoping that my anger would not be directed at him. I did not yell. I simply picked up the entire stack of forged documents and folded them neatly in half. I slipped the papers securely into the inside breast pocket of my suit jacket. I told Mr. Thompson that I was officially confiscating these copies as primary evidence of a felony fraud conspiracy. I instructed him to place an administrative flag on the transaction file to monitor it, but I explicitly ordered him not to call my son or alert the receiving institution yet. If he breathed a single word of this visit to anyone, I promised him I would name him as a willing co-conspirator in the federal lawsuit I was about to file. He nodded frantically, his face pale and shining with sweat, too terrified to speak. James and I turned around and walked out of the glass office, leaving the manager trembling at his desk. We had the weapon they used to stab me in the back. Now we needed to run a digital trace and find out exactly what massive structure they were trying to build with my stolen money. We left the cold, sterile air of the bank and stepped back out into the bright morning sunlight. I walked with my back straight and my hand firmly pressing the folded documents inside my jacket pocket. We got back into James's sedan, but we did not speak during the short drive to his house. The moment we walked through his front door, Melissa rushed over with a cup of coffee, but I politely waved it away. We had the physical evidence of the forgery, but we still needed to know the exact digital destination of the money. I asked James if he could track the routing numbers the bank representative had given us last night over the phone. James nodded silently and immediately opened his laptop on the kitchen table. He was a senior corporate data analyst, and he possessed the exact digital skills required to dismantle my son's financial fortress. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he opened a series of complex tracking programs. He explained that international wire transfers always leave a digital footprint through the central banking networks before they vanish offshore. We stood over his shoulder watching lines of data scroll rapidly across the bright screen. James isolated the specific international routing code that Brian from the fraud department had identified during our midnight phone call. He told me that corporate criminals often use offshore escrow accounts in the Cayman Islands as a temporary holding cell to wash the money before bringing it back into the domestic economy. He ran a highly sophisticated reverse lookup on the receiving institution to find any linked domestic accounts. For several agonizing minutes, the screen showed nothing but encrypted error messages. Then James bypassed a public firewall and accessed a commercial database used by financial institutions to verify international corporate ownership. A new window popped up on the screen displaying a complex web of connected holding companies. James pointed to a single line of code that connected the offshore escrow account directly back to a domestic financial institution right here in our home state. Cameron had not planned on leaving the country with my money. He was simply bouncing the funds through an international loophole to make the transaction untraceable by standard local authorities before bringing it right back home to spend it. The sheer cold calculation behind the move was deeply chilling. James highlighted the receiving domestic account and initiated a comprehensive public records search through the state business registry. He was looking for the specific corporate entity that was waiting to receive the laundered funds. A few seconds later, the official state seal appeared on his screen along with a newly registered corporate charter. The company was a limited liability company registered under the name Apex Heritage Group. I leaned closer to the screen to read the registration details. The company had been formally and legally incorporated exactly 3 months ago. That specific date proved this was not a sudden decision made in a moment of financial panic. Cameron and Vanessa had been meticulously planning this theft for at least 90 days. They had sat at my table eating Sunday dinners and smiling at me while they secretly built a corporate vehicle designed specifically to steal my life savings. I scrolled down to the bottom of the registration page to find the executive board information. There, listed as the sole managing director and primary shareholder of Apex Heritage Group, was my son Cameron. He had built a completely invisible ghost company to hold my stolen money. I stared at the glowing screen, and my engineering mind began to analyze the raw numbers. $850,000 is an incredibly specific amount of money to steal. If Cameron simply wanted to rob me, he would have drained the entire $1 million trust. He took that specific exact amount because he needed it for a very specific purpose. In the commercial engineering sector, that exact percentage is almost always used as a standard 20% down payment for a massive commercial real estate loan. I told James to immediately cross-reference the name Apex Heritage Group with the county commercial real estate pending transaction database. James opened a new browser tab and accessed the public county property records, He typed the name of Cameron's ghost company into the buyer search field and hit enter. The system processed the request for a moment before generating a single massive search result. A highly detailed commercial property purchase agreement filled the entire screen. My son was not just stealing my retirement money to buy luxury cars or tropical vacations. He was secretly executing a massive corporate real estate acquisition using my money as the seed capital. The property listed clearly on the pending purchase agreement was a highly sought-after boutique hotel located directly in the center of the downtown historical district. It was a beautiful, sprawling, historic brick building that had recently been renovated and put on the market for elite commercial investors. I looked at the financial terms of the pending sale and felt a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. The total purchase price for the commercial property was just over $3 million. The stolen $850,000 from my retirement account was listed exactly as the required cash down payment to secure the massive commercial mortgage. Cameron was using the money he stole from his own father to instantly crown himself as a wealthy real estate mogul. He and Vanessa were planning to host lavish parties in that boutique hotel, boasting to their wealthy friends about their brilliant investment strategies, all while I was supposed to be rotting away in a discount-assisted living facility. The absolute audacity of their greed was almost difficult to comprehend. We had found the giant building they were trying to construct with my stolen foundation. Now we needed a way to completely destroy it. I leaned closer to the glowing screen of James' laptop, my eyes scanning the dense legal text of the commercial real estate purchase agreement. The $850,000 down payment was a catastrophic loss, but the mathematical reality of a $3 million total purchase price meant there was a massive financial gap. Cameron needed over $2 million in commercial financing to close the deal and take possession of the boutique hotel. My decades of experience managing massive corporate engineering budgets immediately raised a glaring red flag in my mind. A commercial bank does not simply hand over a $2 million mortgage to a shell company that was formed exactly 90 days ago. They require an ironclad guarantee. They require substantial, unencumbered physical assets to secure the massive loan. I knew Cameron did not have that kind of equity. His own suburban home was heavily mortgaged, and Vanessa drove a luxury vehicle that was leased. They lived entirely on credit and the illusion of wealth. I told James to scroll down to the financing addendum of the contract. I needed to see exactly what Cameron had offered the bank to secure such a massive line of credit. If he was using my cash for the down payment, I had a terrible feeling I knew exactly what he was using to back the rest of the millions. James dragged the cursor down the page, navigating through pages of standard legal boilerplate, until he reached the section detailing the loan origination and the pledged collateral. The text was small, but the words jumped off the screen and struck me with the force of a physical blow. Listed clearly under the primary guarantor assets was a property address. It was not Cameron and Vanessa's suburban address. It was the address of my own home. The historic 4-bedroom house where I had raised my children, where I had paid off the 30-year mortgage with my own blood and sweat, and where my late wife had planted the rose bushes that still bloomed every spring. Cameron had not just stolen my liquid cash. He had actively weaponized my physical sanctuary. He had taken the deed to my fully paid-off home and handed it to a commercial lending institution as a security deposit for his own corporate ambitions. He was literally betting the roof over my head on the success of his boutique hotel venture. The arrogance required to steal a man's life. Savings is one thing, but the absolute sociopathy required to gamble away his home is something entirely different. The sheer mechanical cruelty of the conspiracy became crystal clear in that moment. Cameron had used that forged, durable power of attorney to bypass every single safeguard designed to protect me. He had marched into a commercial lending office, presented himself as my absolute legal guardian, and signed a binding contract that leveraged my home against his debt. If his hotel business failed, Or if he simply decided he did not want to make the monthly payments, the commercial bank would not go after him. They would immediately foreclose on my property. They would send armed sheriffs to physically remove me from the home I owned free and clear, leaving me completely homeless and destitute on the street. The conversation at the dinner table last night echoed in my mind with terrifying clarity. Vanessa talking about moving me into an assisted living facility was not just a condescending insult. It was an active eviction notice. They already knew I was going to lose my house. They were simply trying to manage the fallout by locking me away in a facility before the bank foreclosed on the property, ensuring their wealthy friends never found out what they had done to me. Behind me, Melissa let out a sudden, sharp gasp. She had been reading the screen over my shoulder, and the reality of the collateral agreement had just clicked in her mind. She pointed a trembling finger at the address of her childhood home glowing on the monitor. Tears streamed down her face as she finally understood the absolute depravity of her brother's plan. She whispered that they were going to throw me out on the street like a piece of garbage. She realized that Vanessa's sweet smiles and Cameron's silence at the dinner table were the masks of two predators who were actively destroying her father for their own social elevation. Melissa fell back into a kitchen chair, burying her face in her hands, completely overwhelmed by the pure evil operating within her own family. I did not comfort her this time. She needed to feel the absolute weight of their betrayal, so she would not hesitate when the time came to drop the hammer on them. The truth was ugly, but it was the only thing that could set us free from the illusion of our family. I watched her cry, knowing this pain was the necessary fire to forge our counterattack. I stood up completely straight, letting the cold, calculating mind of the structural engineer take permanent control of my actions. The theft of my retirement funds was a severe crime, but the secret mortgaging of my historic home was the ultimate disrespect. It was a violation of the sacred space where my wife's memory lived. Cameron had crossed a line from which there could be no return, no forgiveness, and no rehabilitation. I told James to close the laptop and print every single page of the documents we had just uncovered. We had the motive, we had the forged weapon, and we had the blueprints to their entire fraudulent empire. Now we needed the legal authority to spring the trap perfectly and without mercy. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and looked at the time. It was exactly 11 in the morning on Monday. We still had 22 hours before the stolen funds permanently cleared into the offshore account and sealed my fate. I told James to get his car keys. We were going to bypass the local police completely and take our massive mountain of evidence directly to the most ruthless corporate litigator in the entire city. The glass doors of the downtown legal firm slid open silently as James and I walked into the lobby. This was not a neighborhood practice that handled minor traffic tickets or simple wills. This firm specialized in hostile corporate takeovers and aggressive financial litigation. The receptionist barely looked up from her polished marble desk before James gave her my name. Within seconds, we were escorted down a long hallway lined with dark wood paneling and expensive abstract art. I had spent my entire career building physical fortresses out of concrete and steel, but this place was a fortress built entirely out of weaponized laws and weaponized language. We were led into a massive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I was not here to seek comfort or emotional counseling for a broken heart. I was here to hire a mercenary to execute a flawless demolition. Mr. Gallagher stood up from behind his massive oak desk as we entered the room. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s wearing a tailored navy suit that projected absolute authority. He did not offer useless platitudes or ask how my day was going. He gestured for us to sit in the heavy leather chairs opposite his desk. I did not sit down immediately. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out the forged, durable power of attorney that I had confiscated from the frightened bank manager earlier that morning. I placed it flat on the center of his desk. Then James opened his leather briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of printed documents detailing the offshore escrow routing numbers, the newly registered corporate charter for Apex Heritage Group, and the commercial purchase agreement that secretly leveraged my historic home as collateral. I looked Mr. Gallagher straight in the eye and told him my son was actively attempting to steal my life savings and my home to build a boutique hotel. Mr. Gallagher did not interrupt me or ask unnecessary questions. He sat down slowly and picked up the forged power of attorney. He ran his thumb over the raised notary seal belonging to Vanessa's best friend. Then he picked up the commercial purchase agreement and began reading the complex financial terms. The office was completely silent for several long minutes, except for the crisp sound of heavy paper turning. I watched his eyes scan the lines of data James had meticulously extracted from the state business registry. Mr. Gallagher was a man who made a lucrative living observing the darkest corners of corporate greed. But I could see a brief flicker of genuine disgust cross his face when he read the clause where Cameron pledged my fully paid-off home as a security asset for his own massive commercial debt. He arranged the papers in a neat line across his desk, interlaced his fingers, and looked up at me with the cold, analytical gaze of a predator assessing a wounded target. I leaned forward and placed both of my hands firmly on his desk. I told him we had a severe ticking clock on our hands. I explained the timeline the bank fraud representative had given me the night before. I told Mr. Gallagher that the stolen $850,000 was currently sitting in a weekend holding queue and that it was scheduled to clear permanently into the Cayman Islands escrow account at exactly 9:00 tomorrow morning. I demanded that he immediately draft an emergency federal injunction to freeze the funds before they crossed international borders. I told him we had absolute proof of the forgery and the financial fraud, so stopping the wire transfer right now should be a simple matter of walking the paperwork into a judge chambers. I wanted to cut off my son's oxygen supply right there and then ending the nightmare before he could close the real estate deal and take possession of the boutique hotel. Mr. Gallagher shook his head slowly. He spoke in a deep, resonant voice that commanded the entire room. He told me that filing an emergency injunction to freeze the account right this second was the absolute worst tactical move we could make. I felt a sharp spike of anger and demanded to know why a corporate litigator would refuse to stop an active felony in progress when handed all the evidence on a silver platter. Mr. Gallagher remained perfectly calm under my frustration. He explained that the banking system is completely automated and entirely devoid of discretion. The moment he filed an injunction to freeze the outgoing wire transfer, the bank computer systems would automatically generate an immediate notification alert. That alert would be sent directly to the email inbox and the mobile phone of the designated legal representative on the account. Because the forged power of attorney was still currently the active controlling document on file, my son Cameron would receive a high-priority alert informing him that his massive financial transfer had been violently intercepted. Mr. Gallagher carefully explained the devastating consequences of tipping them off prematurely. If Cameron received a notification today that the funds were frozen due to suspected fraud, he would instantly realize his trap had been discovered. He would immediately call his wife Vanessa, and they would contact Patricia, the notary. Patricia would have plenty of time to destroy her official notary logbook or fabricate entries claiming I had physically been in her office to sign the document. Cameron would hire his own defense attorneys and claim that he had my verbal permission to use the funds and the home as collateral, arguing that I was simply experiencing a sudden episode of age-related memory loss. Without the physical notary logbook intact to prove perjury, the criminal case would devolve into a drawn-out, miserable legal battle of he said, she said that could drag on in the courts for years. Mr. Gallagher leaned across the desk and told me that if we wanted to completely destroy Cameron and ensure he faced severe federal prison time, we could not stop him from committing the crime. We had to stand back in total silence and let him step entirely into his own trap. Mr. Gallagher leaned back in his heavy leather chair and let his words hang in the quiet air of the office. The concept he was proposing went against every natural instinct a person possesses when they are being robbed. When you see a thief reaching into your pocket, your immediate reaction is to grab their wrist and scream for help. But Mr. Gallagher was an apex predator in the corporate legal world, and he was teaching me how to hunt. He was telling me that if I grabbed my son's wrist right now, Cameron would simply drop the money, claim he was just holding it for safekeeping, and walk away clean. As a structural engineer, I suddenly understood the brutal logic of his strategy. If you want to completely demolish a corrupt building, you do not chip away at the exterior paint. You wait until the entire structure is fully built. You let the maximum amount of weight settle onto the compromised foundation, and then you detonate the central load-bearing columns. We had to let Cameron finish building his trap so we could lock him inside it. I asked Mr. Gallagher to explain the exact legal difference between stopping the wire transfer today and letting it clear on Tuesday morning. He steepled his fingers and delivered a masterclass in federal criminal liability. He explained that right now, technically, Cameron had only initiated a transfer. If we interrupted it, a clever defense attorney could argue it was an administrative error or a simple misunderstanding regarding the legal limits of his paperwork. However, the moment that $850,000 physically crossed the digital border into the Cayman Islands escrow account, the legal reality shifted permanently. It ceased to be a domestic family dispute and immediately became a completed first-degree federal wire fraud. It triggered international money laundering statutes. By letting the clock run out, we were not just allowing Cameron to steal my money. We were allowing him to officially commit a felony that carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The sheer gravity of what we were allowing to happen tissled over the room like a heavy winter blanket. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair because the weight of the strategy was clearly making him anxious. He looked at Mr. Gallagher and asked the obvious question. He wanted to know what would happen if we let the money cross international lines and then failed to retrieve it. It was a massive gamble. We were voluntarily allowing my entire life savings to vanish into an offshore black hole simply to ensure my son went to prison. The risk was absolute. If Mr. Gallagher was wrong, or if Cameron moved the money out of the escrow account faster than we anticipated, I would be left completely destitute, and Cameron would be sitting on a beach as a millionaire. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I was gambling the money I had earned through 40 years of grueling physical labor. But I looked at the forged signature on the desk, remembering the absolute callousness in my son's eyes during Sunday dinner, and my resolve hardened into solid steel. I told James that I would rather lose every single penny I owned than spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for my son to finish destroying me. Mr. Gallagher nodded slowly, with a dark smile touching the corners of his mouth. He respected absolute resolve. He told us that to execute this strategy perfectly, we needed to employ the most difficult tactic of all. We had to embrace total and complete silence. For the next 24 hours, we had to become ghosts. I could not call my bank to ask for updates. James could not use his corporate computer to run any more digital traces that might trigger a security firewall. And most importantly, we had to maintain the illusion that I was a frail, confused old man recovering from a minor cardiac event. Mr. Gallagher instructed me to have Melissa send a very brief and highly casual text message to her brother later that afternoon. She was to say that the emergency room doctors had kept me overnight for simple observation, and that I was resting comfortably without access to my phone. We had to feed Cameron the exact narrative he desperately wanted to hear, so he would proceed with his financial closing without looking over his shoulder. The psychological discipline required to pull this off was going to be agonizing. I thought about Vanessa sitting in her designer kitchen, probably sipping expensive wine and celebrating their imminent wealth. I thought about Cameron aggressively finalizing his catering plans for the boutique hotel grand opening, completely convinced that his elderly father was lying in a hospital bed entirely unaware of his impending homelessness. Every instinct in my body screamed to drive to his house, kick down his expensive front door, and throw the forged legal documents right in his arrogant face. But I forced those emotions down, locking them away in a dark vault inside my mind. I was a man of science, mathematics, and structural integrity. I knew that emotional outbursts only served to relieve temporary pressure, while silent, calculated execution delivered permanent results. I looked at James, who was watching me closely, and gave him a single definitive nod. We were going to maintain the radio silence. We were going to let the thieves sleep peacefully tonight, entirely unaware that the floor beneath their beds was about to open up and swallow them whole. I turned my attention back to the imposing litigator sitting across the desk. I told Mr. Gallagher that I authorized his strategy completely. I formally instructed him not to file the emergency injunction to stop the wire transfer. We were going to let the $850,000 hit the Cayman Islands escrow account at exactly 9 a.m. on Tuesday. We were going to let Cameron take full legal possession of the stolen funds and use them to finalize the commercial mortgage on the historic downtown property. We were going to let him wrap the rope completely around his own neck and pull it tight. Mr. Gallagher leaned forward and gathered the forged documents and the corporate registry printouts into a neat stack. He placed them inside a thick leather legal folder, snapping the brass clasp shut with a sound that echoed like a judge striking a gavel. The decision was made. The trap was set, and the countdown clock was officially ticking. We had 20 hours left to wait in the dark, and then we were going to bring my son's empire crashing down to the ground. James drove us back to his house under a heavy silence. The afternoon stretched into the evening with agonizing slowness. I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone completely cold hours ago. Melissa paced the wooden floor, jumping every time a car drove past the front window, terrified that Cameron might show up or call to check on my fake heart condition. I did not allow myself to pace or show any outward signs of panic. I kept my hands folded on the table, staring at the printed copies of the real estate contract and the forged legal documents. To keep my mind from spiraling into a dark rage, I treated the paperwork exactly like an engineering schematic. I searched for stress points and structural weaknesses in my son's arrogant plan. He had built a massive financial tower on a foundation of lies, but I knew from decades of professional experience that every hasty construction project contained a hidden fatal flaw. A builder who rushes to erect the walls always neglects the integrity of the base. I just had to wait patiently for Mr. Gallagher to find the crack in the concrete. The breakthrough came precisely at 9:00 that Monday night. My cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden table, shattering the quiet tension in the room. The caller identification displayed the private office number of Mr. Gallagher. I answered immediately, pressing the speaker button so James and Melissa could hear the conversation clearly. I expected the lawyer to give us a standard update on his basic preparations for tomorrow morning. Instead, Mr. Gallagher sounded entirely different. The cold, calculated tone from this afternoon had been completely replaced by a sharp, almost predatory edge of absolute triumph. He did not bother with a polite greeting or ask how my evening was going. He simply told me to sit down and grab a pen, because he had just spent the last 6 hours forensically dismantling the corporate charter of Apex Heritage Group line by line, and he had found the exact legal detonator we needed to blow my son's empire into absolute dust. Mr. Gallagher began to explain the complex anatomy of commercial real estate law. He told us that when Cameron set up his ghost company, he intentionally structured it as a limited liability corporation. Cameron did this to completely shield his own personal assets from any potential bankruptcy or financial ruin. If the boutique hotel failed miserably, the bank could seize the business property, but they could not touch Cameron's suburban home or his wife's luxury car. It was a cowardly corporate shield used by greedy developers who wanted all the profit with absolutely none of the personal risk. But Mr. Gallagher explained that commercial lending institutions are not foolish, and they do not hand out millions of dollars based on a simple promise. They saw that Cameron's new company had zero operating history, zero incoming revenue streams, and zero liquid cash. To approve a $3 million commercial mortgage, the bank demanded an ironclad guarantee. They demanded physical collateral that far exceeded the value of the actual loan. This was exactly why Cameron had been forced to aggressively pledge my historic home as collateral. He desperately needed the massive equity I had built over 40 years to secure the loan and legitimize his empty shell company. However, Mr. Gallagher explained that this desperate move created a massive legal vulnerability. In order to legally pledge my property to the bank, Cameron had to use the forged power of attorney to list my actual name on the commercial mortgage agreement. But he could not just list me as a passive asset donor. The strict banking regulations required the actual owner of the collateral to be legally bound to the corporate entity holding the loan. Cameron had forged my signature on a secondary addendum, officially naming me as the primary guarantor for Apex Heritage Group. He thought it was just another piece of meaningless paperwork, a temporary lie to satisfy the bank's underwriting department, so they would release the millions. He assumed the bank would simply file the document away in a dark cabinet and never look at it again. Mr. Gallagher's voice echoed through the kitchen as he revealed the fatal flaw in that assumption. He explained a highly specific and rarely utilized clause in our state corporate liability statutes. According to the law, when a primary guarantor provides more than 50% of the total collateral weight for a newly formed limited liability company, that guarantor is not just a passive financial backer. To protect innocent investors from fraudulent corporate mismanagement, the state law automatically grants the primary guarantor emergency executive voting rights. Mr. Gallagher paused, letting the immense gravity of the legal statute sink into the quiet room. Because my fully paid-off historic home represented the vast majority of the tangible collateral backing the entire $3 million venture, the law considered me the ultimate financial authority behind the business. The state statutes were designed specifically to prevent exactly what Cameron was trying to do, and he had blindly walked right into the trap. James gasped out loud, his hands flying to his mouth as the mathematics of the legal trap finally clicked in his analytical mind. Mr. Gallagher confirmed the brilliant realization. By forging my name as the primary guarantor, Cameron had accidentally handed me the master keys to his entire corporate kingdom. I was not just a helpless victim who had his retirement money stolen in the dark. Under the strict and unforgiving letter of the law, I was the legal shadow owner of Apex Heritage Group. I possessed the unilateral legal authority to fire the executive board, terminate the managing director, seize all corporate assets, and completely liquidate the company without needing a single vote of approval from my son. Cameron had been so blinded by his greed, so entirely focused on stealing the $850,000, that he never bothered to read the fine print of the corporate charter he was signing. He had built an impenetrable financial fortress, but he had legally registered the deed to the entire castle directly in my name. The absolute genius of the counterattack laid itself out before me with breathtaking clarity. Mr. Gallagher laid out the revised battle plan for tomorrow morning. We were still going to let the stolen money clear into the Cayman Islands escrow account at 9 o'clock. But we were not just going to freeze the funds anymore. The second the money crossed the international border and the commercial mortgage became officially active, Mr. Gallagher would electronically file an emergency corporate resolution with the state registry. Using my absolute power as the primary guarantor, I was going to execute a hostile takeover of my son's own company. I would instantly absorb the $3 million boutique hotel, the stolen cash, and the corporate entity itself. We would transfer the entire business directly into my personal trust. Cameron would be violently stripped of his company and his stolen wealth in a matter of seconds. But because his name was still on the original fraudulent loan application, he would remain personally liable for the massive federal bank fraud and the commercial debt. He was going to lose everything, and we were going to use his own forged signature to facilitate his total destruction. The checkmate was absolute. I thanked Mr. Gallagher for his brilliant work and disconnected the call. The silence in the kitchen felt entirely different now. It was no longer the terrified silence of the hunted, but the absolute stillness of the hunter waiting for the sun to rise. Tuesday morning broke with a cold, gray sky that perfectly matched the atmosphere inside Mr. Gallagher's downtown office. We had arrived precisely at 8 o'clock. Nobody spoke. James sat gripping a styrofoam coffee cup, while Melissa stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the waking city. I sat directly across from Mr. Gallagher, watching the digital clock on his mahogany desk slowly tick toward the 9 o'clock deadline. For the past 36 hours, I had played the role of a terrified victim hiding in the shadows. But as the final minutes slipped away, my anxiety was entirely replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. Cameron had enjoyed his weekend, believing he had successfully outsmarted an old man. He had no idea that he was currently standing on a trapdoor, and that my hand was resting firmly on the lever. Mr. Gallagher had his laptop open, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, already logged directly into the state corporate registry and the federal banking portal. We were just waiting for the international banking networks to open their gates. At exactly 8:59, the silence in the room became almost unbearable. I watched the seconds digit on the desk clock flash silently. 57, 58, 59, 9 o'clock sharp. Mr. Gallagher hit the refresh button on his banking portal. The screen went blank for a fraction of a second before reloading with new data. The pending status next to the $850,000 wire transfer instantly vanished. In its place appeared a bright green confirmation checkmark, indicating the transaction was fully complete and permanently settled. The money had officially crossed the international border and landed securely inside the Cayman Islands escrow account. It was done. Cameron had successfully executed the final phase of his theft. He had stolen my life savings to fund his massive commercial mortgage, officially crossing the line from a domestic dispute into a first-degree federal wire fraud. A heavy sigh escaped Melissa's lips, but I did not blink. I looked at Mr. Gallagher and gave him a single sharp nod. Mr. Gallagher did not waste a single second celebrating. He immediately switched tabs on his browser and opened the emergency corporate resolution he had spent all day Monday drafting. Because the forged loan documents legally designated me as the primary guarantor backing more than 50% of the corporate debt, I did not need to file a lawsuit to take control. I simply had to exercise my statutory right to seize the reins of the failing company. Mr. Gallagher attached my digital signature to the hostile takeover documents and submitted them directly into the State Business Registry portal through his expedited legal access account. The system processed the forms instantly. With 3 simple clicks of a mouse, the executive board of Apex Heritage Group was entirely dissolved. Cameron was legally terminated as the managing director and completely stripped of his shareholder rights. In the eyes of the state and the federal government, I was now the sole executive officer and 100% owner of the limited liability company my son had built to destroy me. The financial implications of what we had just accomplished were absolutely staggering. By legally absorbing Apex Heritage Group, I had instantly taken ownership of everything the company possessed. The $3 million boutique hotel located in the historic downtown district now belonged entirely to me. The $850,000 sitting in the offshore escrow account was no longer stolen money. It was now a legitimate corporate asset belonging to a company that I completely controlled. Cameron had spent months meticulously building a financial empire and laundering my money to buy his dream property, and I had legally stolen his entire castle in less than 40 seconds. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction wash over me. I was a structural engineer, and I had just performed the most flawless, controlled demolition of my entire career without a single stick of dynamite. My son was completely disarmed and utterly penniless, but he had absolutely no idea it had happened yet. Mr. Gallagher leaned back in his heavy leather chair and explained the most devastating part of the trap. While I had legally seized all the assets of the company, the original fraudulent mortgage application was still signed exclusively by Cameron. He was the one who had walked into the commercial bank, presented the forged power of attorney, and personally guaranteed the remaining $2 million of commercial debt. Because I had ousted him through a hostile corporate takeover rather than dissolving the loan, The massive debt remained entirely attached to his name. Cameron no longer owned the boutique hotel, and he no longer had access to the down payment money, but he was still legally on the hook for millions of dollars to a ruthless commercial lending institution. He was going to spend the rest of his life working to pay off a mortgage for a luxury property that belonged to the father he had tried to throw out on the street. We had secured the legal victory, but the absolute destruction of his facade was still required. A man who steals from his family relies on secrecy and shame to protect him. I was not going to let Cameron hide behind closed doors. Mr. Gallagher printed the freshly stamped state corporate registry certificates, proving my absolute ownership of the hotel. I folded the heavy documents and placed them securely into the breast pocket of my suit, right next to the copies of the forged notary seals. Cameron and Vanessa were hosting a lavish pre-closing cocktail party at the boutique hotel that very evening to show off their supposed wealth to their high society friends. They thought they were going to celebrate their brilliant real estate acquisition. I stood up from the leather chair and adjusted my tie. I told James and Melissa to go home and get dressed in their best evening wear. We were going to crash the grand opening. We were going to walk into the center of his fake empire and hand him his absolute ruin in front of every single person he was trying to impress. The sun had completely set by the time James parked his sedan across the street from the historic downtown boutique hotel. The exterior of the massive brick building was illuminated by expensive architectural uplighting that cast long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. A long red carpet had been rolled out over the front steps leading up to the heavy brass doors. Valets in crisp white shirts were busy parking a steady stream of imported luxury cars. I stood on the sidewalk wearing my tailored charcoal suit, watching the spectacle unfold. Cameron had spared absolutely no expense for his grand celebration. He was spending tens of thousands of dollars on ice sculptures and premium catering just to stroke his own ego. It was profoundly sickening to realize that every single dollar funding this extravagant display of wealth had been stolen directly from my retirement trust. I buttoned my suit jacket and felt the heavy weight of the state corporate registry documents resting securely in my inside pocket. The paper was my weapon, and the hotel across the street was the battlefield. We crossed the street and walked up the steps, bypassing the valet station entirely. The heavy brass doors were propped open by two security guards who simply assumed we were invited guests based on the expensive cut of our suits. We stepped into the grand lobby, and the sheer scale of my son's arrogance washed over me. The massive vaulted ceilings echoed with the music of a live string quartet, playing classical music in the corner. Waiters in black tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and expensive caviar appetizers. The room was absolutely packed with the local elite. I recognized city council members, wealthy suburban developers, and influential socialites. Cameron had invited everyone who mattered in the local high society to witness his grand ascension into the real estate aristocracy. He wanted an audience to validate his stolen success. He wanted the world to see him as a brilliant businessman who had built an empire from the ground up. I stood quietly near the entrance, letting the shadows of a large marble pillar conceal my presence, while I surveyed the room. It did not take long to spot my son. Cameron was standing near the center of the lobby, holding a glass of amber liquor and laughing loudly at a joke someone had just told. He was wearing a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket that probably cost more than my first car. He looked incredibly relaxed and entirely confident. He was slapping other men on the back, shaking hands, and accepting early congratulations on his massive commercial acquisition. He was playing the role of the visionary corporate leader with nauseating perfection. He truly believed he had outsmarted the entire banking system and his own elderly father. He was standing in the middle of a $3 million property, completely convinced that he owned the very floor beneath his expensive leather shoes. He had absolutely no idea that he was actually trespassing in a building that belonged entirely to me. A few feet away from Cameron, I spotted Vanessa holding court with her own circle of wealthy friends. She was wearing a beautiful designer gown that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. Diamonds sparkled at her throat and wrists. She was speaking animatedly, gesturing with her champagne flute, while her friends listened with rapt attention. Right beside her, smiling and nodding, was Patricia, the corrupt notary, who had forged the legal seal on my death warrant. They were clinking their glasses together, toasting to their successful criminal conspiracy. I watched Vanessa lean in and say something to the group that made them all burst into polite laughter. I knew exactly what she was likely telling them. She was probably explaining how difficult it had been to manage my sudden declining health, and how she had heroically taken on the burden of managing my estate to protect our family. She was using my supposed dementia as a tragic backstory to elevate her own social status in a room full of strangers. The absolute hypocrisy of the scene burned in my chest, but I did not let the anger break my focus. I remembered sitting at their dining room table just 2 days ago eating roast beef, while Vanessa condescendingly suggested locking me away in an assisted living facility. They had treated me like an expired burden, a useless old man who was taking up too much space in the world. Yet here they were, throwing a lavish party to celebrate a financial empire built entirely on my blood sweat and decades of manual labor. They had stolen my past, my present, and my future, simply to buy their way into a room full of arrogant socialites. They did not care about the historic value of the building or the legacy of the business. They only cared about the reflection of themselves in the eyes of the wealthy elite. They were parasites dressed in formal wear, feeding entirely off a host they believed they had successfully paralyzed. I looked over my shoulder to check my perimeter. James was standing right behind me, his jaw clenched tight as he watched Cameron parade around the room. Melissa stood next to him, wearing a beautiful dark evening dress, her eyes blazing with a fierce protective anger that I had never seen in her before. She was no longer the timid sister afraid of her dominant older brother. She was fully awake to the monster he truly was. Beside her stood Mr. Gallagher, looking completely at ease in the lavish environment. The corporate litigator simply checked his expensive wristwatch and gave me a slight nod indicating that the timing was absolutely perfect. The trap was fully loaded, and the prey was standing directly in the center of the crosshairs, completely distracted by their own blinding vanity. I took one final deep breath of the champagne-scented air, letting the cold logic of the structural engineer take absolute control of my nervous system. It was time to step out from behind the marble pillar. It was time to walk directly into the light and completely demolish my son's fictional universe. I stepped out from the shadows of the massive marble pillar and began walking directly toward the center of the ballroom. James, Melissa, and Mr. Gallagher fell into step right beside me, forming an impenetrable wall of dark suits and absolute purpose. We did not stop to accept glasses of champagne from the passing waiters, and we did not offer polite smiles to the confused guests who turned to look at us. Our collective demeanor was completely out of place in a room filled with forced laughter and superficial celebrations. The wealthy socialites and local politicians instinctively stepped aside to let us pass, sensing the heavy gravity of our approach. We moved through the sea of silk gowns and velvet jackets like a slow-moving storm front. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my son, who was still laughing loudly, with a group of investors completely oblivious to the fact that his demolition crew had just arrived on the site. It took exactly 30 seconds for Cameron to finally notice us. He was raising his glass to take another sip of his expensive amber liquor when his eyes swept across the room and locked onto my face. The transformation was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying to witness. The charming, confident smile completely vanished from his mouth, replaced by a sudden flash of absolute terror. His face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray under the bright crystal chandeliers. He abruptly excused himself from the group of wealthy developers, nearly spilling his drink on a woman standing next to him. He practically sprinted across the polished marble floor to intercept us before we could reach the center of the room. He planted himself directly in my path, blocking my way with his body, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me just as he had always done when he wanted to dominate a room. Cameron leaned in close, his face flushed with a sudden violent anger that he was desperately trying to conceal from his important guests. He hissed at me through clenched teeth, demanding to know what I was doing here, ruining his most important night. His voice was trembling with a pathetic mixture of rage and panic. He reminded me that I was supposed to be in the cardiac ward of the regional hospital, recovering from a near-fatal heart attack. I did not flinch, and I did not step back. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached observation of an engineer inspecting a crumbling wall. Seeing that his physical intimidation was failing to produce the desired result, his panic began to escalate into pure arrogance. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest and ordered me to turn around and walk out the front doors immediately. He leaned closer and whispered that I was trespassing on his private commercial property, and that if I did not leave right this second, he would have his security guards physically throw me out onto the street. Before I could even formulate a response to his hollow threat, a wave of heavy floral perfume washed over us. Vanessa had noticed the sudden tension and abandoned her circle of socialite friends to rush over to her husband. She arrived with her corrupt notary friend, Patricia, trailing closely behind her like an obedient shadow. Vanessa took one look at my perfectly tailored suit and the cold expression on my face, and she instantly realized that the narrative she had carefully constructed was collapsing. But she was a woman who had spent her entire life manipulating reality to serve her own vanity. She immediately plastered a look of profound, tragic sympathy across her perfectly made-up face. She reached out and attempted to place her hand gently on my arm, playing the role of the deeply concerned and loving daughter-in-law for anyone who might be watching us from the crowd. I simply stepped back, leaving her hand hovering uselessly in the empty air. Vanessa realized that quiet manipulation was not going to work, so she immediately escalated her tactics to a calculated public humiliation. She deliberately raised her voice, ensuring that her words would easily carry to the groups of wealthy investors and local politicians standing nearby. She adopted a high-pitched, trembling tone that dripped with weaponized pity. She announced to the surrounding guests that she was so incredibly sorry for the disturbance. She claimed that my sudden appearance at the party was a tragic consequence of my rapidly deteriorating mental state. She looked at the crowd with fake tears glistening in her eyes and loudly declared that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. She told everyone that I must have become deeply confused and wandered out of my hospital bed, somehow finding my way to their new property. She expertly painted a picture of me as a pathetic, broken old man who no longer possessed the mental capacity to understand reality, let alone manage his own life or his own finances. The surrounding crowd immediately fell silent. Conversations abruptly stopped, and dozens of guests turned to stare at me with a mixture of discomfort and quiet pity. Vanessa had perfectly trapped me in a social corner. If I raised my voice to defend myself or started shouting about stolen bank transfers, I would simply look exactly like the crazy, confused old man she was claiming I was. She smiled at me, a cold, triumphant smirk, hidden behind her mask of tragic concern, believing she had successfully neutralized the threat. Beside me, Melissa let out a sharp gasp of pure outrage and took a step forward, ready to tear her sister-in-law apart. I calmly reached out and placed my hand firmly on Melissa's shoulder, holding her back. I did not need to scream or engage in a pathetic public argument with a woman who owned absolutely nothing. I looked at Mr. Gallagher, who simply adjusted his tie and offered a very faint, satisfied smile. The audience was now completely silent and absolutely focused on us. Vanessa had intentionally gathered the crowd to witness my humiliation, but she had actually just handed me the exact captive audience I needed to execute my final strike. I did not waste my breath arguing with Vanessa or acknowledging her pathetic theatrical performance. I simply turned my body and walked right past her outstretching arms. Cameron tried to step in front of me again to block my path, but James and Mr. Gallagher seamlessly moved forward, using their own physical presence to push him aside. They did not touch him aggressively, but their combined momentum forced my son to stumble backward, yielding the floor. I walked deliberately toward the small, elevated stage in the corner of the grand lobby, where the string quartet had abruptly stopped playing their instruments. The crowd of wealthy socialites and local politicians parted before me like a wave yielding to a heavy ship. I stepped onto the low wooden platform and walked directly to the standing microphone that Cameron had proudly set up for his own victory speech. I wrapped my hand around the cold metal stand and tapped the top of the microphone twice. The sharp thumping sound echoed through the massive vaulted ceilings, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The silence that fell over the grand lobby was immediate and absolute. I looked out over the sea of expensive suits and designer evening gowns. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice entirely level, projecting the calm, absolute authority of a man who had spent 40 years directing massive commercial construction projects. I spoke clearly into the microphone, telling the gathered crowd that I wanted to sincerely thank them all for coming out tonight to celebrate this momentous occasion. I addressed Vanessa's desperate lie directly without ever raising my voice or showing a single trace of anger. I assured the guests that despite what my daughter-in-law had just dramatically claimed, my mental faculties were functioning with absolute perfect clarity. I explained that a man does not successfully engineer the structural foundations of commercial high-rise buildings for 4 decades, if his mind is slipping into darkness. I told the crowd that my memory was flawless, my grasp of complex corporate mathematics had never been sharper, and I knew exactly where I was standing. I saw Vanessa physically shrink back into the crowd, her face flushing bright red, as her pathetic illusion of the confused old man was instantly shattered by my calm, measured articulation. I shifted my gaze from the whispering crowd and locked my eyes directly onto my son. Cameron was standing frozen near the front row, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. I spoke into the microphone again and told the audience that I was incredibly proud of Cameron and Vanessa. I announced that they had spent the last 3 months secretly dedicating all of their time and energy into finding the absolute perfect commercial investment property to serve as the new crown jewel of my retirement portfolio. The crowd murmured in polite confusion, clearly trying to reconcile Vanessa's tragic story of my severe dementia with my highly articulate speech about elite corporate real estate acquisitions. Cameron stared at me, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with a growing horrified realization that I was not just raving about a stolen bank account. He realized with terrifying clarity that I knew exactly what building we were standing in, and I knew exactly what he was trying to do. I continued my speech painting a detailed picture of a brilliant financial strategy that Cameron had supposedly executed entirely on my behalf. I told the crowd that my son had recognized the incredible historic value of this boutique hotel. I spoke the exact dollar amount of the $3 million purchase price clearly into the microphone, letting the massive number echo off the marble walls. Then I delivered the first devastating blow. I announced that Cameron had successfully utilized exactly $850,000 of my personal cash to secure the down payment for this magnificent property just this morning. I watched the color completely drain from Cameron's face as I broadcast the exact specific number of the money he had stolen. The wealthy investors standing around him began to exchange confused and deeply uncomfortable glances. They were starting to realize that the brilliant self-made real estate mogul they had been drinking with was apparently using his elderly father's bank account to secretly fund his empire. I stepped down from the small wooden stage, leaving the microphone behind. The heavy silence in the room followed me as I walked slowly across the polished marble floor, stopping exactly 2 feet in front of my son. Cameron was shaking slightly, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for an exit or a friendly face that did not exist. I reached slowly into the inside breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out the thick, folded stack of heavy parchment paper bearing the official raised seals of the state corporate registry. I held the documents out toward him. Cameron hesitated, his hands trembling violently, before he finally reached out and took the papers from my hand. I told him quietly, but loudly enough, for the entire front row of guests to hear that he needed to read the executive board details listed on the second page. I watched his eyes scan the complex legal text. I watched his pupils dilate as his brain finally processed the devastating reality of his own massive legal failure. Cameron read the emergency corporate resolution that Mr. Gallagher had filed just hours ago. He saw his own name completely removed from the managing director position of Apex Heritage Group. He saw my name listed prominently as the absolute sole executive officer and 100% shareholder of the limited liability company. He looked up at me, his breathing shallow and rapid, desperately whispering that this was impossible because he had registered the company himself. I did not whisper back. I spoke with the crushing weight of a falling steel beam. I explained to him right there in front of his wealthy peers that when he forged my signature to leverage my historic home as collateral, he had legally designated me as the primary guarantor of the corporate debt. I informed him that state law automatically grants emergency executive control to the primary asset holder to prevent fraudulent mismanagement. I watched the final remaining shreds of his arrogance evaporate into the cold air. He realized that by trying to steal my house, he had legally handed me the master keys to his entire corporate kingdom. The checkmate was now absolute and irreversible. I told Cameron that I had successfully executed a hostile corporate takeover of his ghost company at exactly 9:00 this morning. The precise second his stolen wire transfer had cleared into the offshore escrow account. I informed him that the $3 million boutique hotel we were currently standing in belonged entirely to me. I explained that the stolen $850,000 was now a legally secured corporate asset under my exclusive control. And then I delivered the final lethal consequence of his incredible greed. I told him that because he had personally signed the commercial mortgage application using the forged power of attorney, he was still personally liable for the remaining $2 million of commercial debt. He had lost the company, he had lost the building, and he had lost the stolen cash, but he was still going to spend the rest of his miserable life paying off a massive loan for a property he no longer owned. I reached into my pocket one last time and pulled out the expensive catering invoice that Mr. Gallagher had intercepted from the corporate email account. I tucked the folded paper neatly into the front pocket of Cameron's expensive velvet dinner jacket. I told him that since he and his friends were currently trespassing on my private property, the party was officially over, and my new company would certainly not be paying for his extravagant ice sculptures. I stepped back after slipping the catering invoice into the front pocket of his velvet jacket. Cameron stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant real estate mogul had completely vanished, and in his place stood a terrified little boy caught in a massive lie. He looked down at the state corporate registry documents trembling in his hands, and then looked back up at me with eyes wide with sheer panic. He tried to whisper desperately, begging me to step into a private office to discuss this like a family. He promised he would pay me back every single penny with interest once the hotel started making a profit. He was still trying to negotiate a business deal while standing in the middle of a burning building. Vanessa, who had been listening to every word from a few feet away, finally understood the catastrophic reality of the situation. The fake tears of pity instantly dried up on her face. She looked at her husband with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound terror, realizing that the massive commercial debt was now entirely their problem, and the millions of dollars were gone. Before Cameron could utter another pathetic apology, a loud mechanical clank echoed from the front of the lobby. The heavy brass doors of the boutique hotel were suddenly thrown wide open, hitting the marble walls with a resounding crash that made several guests jump in surprise. The remaining ambient noise in the ballroom instantly died. Through the grand entrance walked 6 men and women wearing dark suits and navy blue windbreakers with bright yellow letters printed across their backs. They were not local city police officers arriving to respond to a simple noise complaint. They were federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. They moved with absolute tactical precision, fanning out across the entrance to secure the perimeter of the room. The atmosphere in the lavish lobby shifted from uncomfortable social tension to pure, primal fear. The wealthy investors, city council members, and influential socialites instinctively backed away, pressing themselves against the brick walls to clear a wide path. Nobody wanted to be standing anywhere near the epicenter of a sudden federal raid. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely unreadable expression, walked directly toward the center of the room. His heavy boots clicked loudly against the polished marble floor, echoing in the absolute silence of the ballroom. He did not ask for permission to speak, and he did not offer a polite greeting to the terrified guests. He stopped right next to where I was standing and looked directly at my son. He asked in a loud, booming voice if he was speaking to Cameron. My son could not even form the words to answer. He just gave a tiny, pathetic nod, his face completely drained of all blood. The lead agent pulled a folded document from his jacket and began reading the federal arrest warrant aloud for the entire high society crowd to hear. He formally charged Cameron with first-degree wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit massive federal bank fraud. Each charge hung in the air like a physical blow, completely destroying any remaining shred of Cameron's carefully constructed public reputation. The lead agent signaled to two of his deputies, who immediately stepped forward and grabbed Cameron by the arms. The sharp, metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the quiet room. Cameron finally snapped out of his paralyzed state and began to panic wildly. His perfectly styled hair fell into his eyes as he struggled against the agents. He turned his head and looked directly at me, his voice breaking as he desperately begged me to call them off. He cried out, asking his father to tell the federal agents that it was all just a big misunderstanding and that I had given him permission to use the money. I did not move a single muscle to help him. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with the cold, unforgiving logic of a structural engineer. I told him that a man who intentionally sets fire to his own house does not get to complain about the heat. I turned my back on him completely, severing the final emotional thread that tied me to the son I had once loved. The nightmare was not over for the rest of the conspirators. Another pair of federal agents bypassed Cameron entirely and walked directly toward Vanessa and her corrupt notary friend, Patricia. Vanessa saw them coming and completely lost her mind. The sophisticated, elegant hostess vanished instantly. She began screaming hysterically at the top of her lungs, pointing her finger at Cameron and Patricia. She shouted to the agents that she had absolutely nothing to do with the forged documents and that her husband had forced her to go along with the plan. She brutally threw her husband and her absolute best friend right under the bus in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save herself. The agents did not care about her screaming confessions. They calmly grabbed her arms and locked the cold steel handcuffs around her wrists, right over her expensive diamond bracelets. Patricia began sobbing uncontrollably, collapsing to her knees in her designer gown as the agents pulled her up and handcuffed her for federal perjury and notary fraud. The two women who had toasted their brilliance just 20 minutes ago were now sobbing criminals in front of their entire social circle. The federal agents quickly organized their prisoners and began the long, humiliating walk toward the front doors. Cameron, Vanessa, and Patricia were marched directly through the center of the grand lobby they had proudly claimed as their own. They were forced to walk past the hundreds of wealthy guests they had desperately wanted to impress. I watched as several of the socialites and local politicians pulled out their smartphones and began recording the entire pathetic scene. The flashing lights of the camera phones illuminated Cameron's tear-streaked face as he stared at the floor, entirely broken. James stood beside me with a look of profound justice on his face, while Melissa wiped away a single tear, not of sadness, but of absolute relief. Mr. Gallagher quietly checked his watch, satisfied with a perfectly executed legal demolition. Through the open brass doors, I could see the bright red and blue emergency lights of the federal cruisers reflecting off the dark street. I stood tall in the center of my new boutique hotel, watching the police cars drive away, knowing that my legacy was finally secure and the toxic rot had been completely removed from my family foundation. James, Melissa, Mr. Gallagher and I followed the procession out through the heavy brass doors and stood at the top of the concrete steps. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the sharp reality of the flashing red and blue lights from the federal cruisers blocking the street. The valet attendants and the remaining guests had spilled out onto the sidewalk, watching in absolute stunned silence. Cameron, Vanessa, and Patricia were being pushed toward the back seats of separate vehicles. The sophisticated facade they had so desperately maintained inside the ballroom was completely shattered on the pavement. The cold steel of the handcuffs caught the harsh glare of the emergency lights, proving to the entire world that their wealth was nothing but a pathetic criminal illusion. As the federal agents opened the door to the cruiser, Vanessa finally stopped sobbing, and her panic abruptly shifted into a vicious, blinding rage. She refused to get into the back of the car, planting her high heels firmly on the asphalt. She twisted her body around to face Cameron, who was being loaded into the vehicle right behind hers. She began screaming at him at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing violently down the historic city street. She called him a pathetic failure and a completely useless coward. She shouted to the federal agents that Cameron had manipulated her into signing the documents, and that she had absolutely no idea the money was stolen. She was desperately trying to rewrite history right there on the sidewalk, entirely willing to send her own husband to federal prison for the rest of his life if it meant she could walk away clean. Cameron stopped resisting the agents and just stood by the open door of his cruiser, staring at his wife in absolute horror. The betrayal he had so easily inflicted upon me at the Sunday dinner table was now being inflicted directly upon him by the woman he had committed the crime to please. He saw the genuine hatred in her eyes and realized that their entire marriage had been built on nothing but money and superficial status. The moment the stolen money vanished, her supposed love for him had instantly turned into toxic venom. He did not yell back at her or try to defend himself. He just lowered his head, entirely broken by the sheer weight of his complete and absolute failure. The federal agent placed a firm hand on his shoulder and pushed him down into the dark back seat of the police car. The heavy metal door slammed shut, cutting off his final view of the crumbling empire he had tried to steal. The agents forced Vanessa into her own vehicle, ignoring her desperate screams, and slammed that door shut as well. Patricia was loaded into the third car, still crying uncontrollably. The engines roared to life, and the sirens began to wail, cutting through the quiet night air. I stood perfectly still on the top step, watching the 3 federal cruisers accelerate down the street until their flashing lights disappeared around the corner. The marriage that had plotted my destruction was completely dead, and the son who had tried to ruin me was gone. The heavy silence slowly returned to the historic avenue. Melissa let out a long, trembling sigh, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. Mr. Gallagher buttoned his suit jacket and quietly congratulated me on a flawlessly executed legal operation. I looked up at the massive brick facade of the boutique hotel that I now completely owned, feeling a profound sense of peace finally settle over my mind. Wednesday morning brought a quiet clarity that I had not felt in years. I sat once again in the heavy leather chair in Mr. Gallagher's office, but the frantic ticking clock that had haunted us on Monday was completely gone. The federal authorities had formally denied bail for Cameron and Vanessa, citing them as severe flight risks given their clear intent to move massive amounts of money offshore. With the immediate threat completely neutralized, it was time to rebuild the foundation of my life. I told Mr. Gallagher that I did not want to leave a single crack in my estate for any future opportunistic thieves to exploit. We spread my entire financial portfolio across his mahogany desk and began the meticulous process of scrubbing my son from every single legal document I owned. I revoked every previous medical directive and nullified any old banking authorizations, ensuring Cameron could never speak for me again. The most crucial step was drafting a completely new last will and testament. I did not simply omit Cameron from the document, because I knew from my engineering days that ambiguity invites structural collapse. Instead, Mr. Gallagher drafted a highly specific disinheritance clause. I explicitly stated that my biological son was to receive absolutely nothing from my estate upon my passing. I left him a single symbolic dollar just to legally prove that he had not been accidentally forgotten, but had been consciously and deliberately removed. As I signed my name at the bottom of the page, I did not feel a heavy burden of sorrow. The grief had already been processed and discarded in the grocery store parking lot days ago. What I felt now was the profound lightness of a man who had successfully amputated a toxic infection before it could reach his heart. He had chosen money over his family, and now he would spend the rest of his life with neither. With the rot completely removed, we moved on to fortifying the remaining assets. I instructed Mr. Gallagher to construct an impenetrable legal fortress around my wealth. We established a brand new, irrevocable family trust. Into this vault, I placed the deed to my fully paid-off historic home, ensuring that no commercial bank could ever threaten it again. Then we transferred the absolute ownership of the $3 million downtown boutique hotel directly into the same protective structure. The hotel was no longer a symbol of my son's devastating greed. It was now a powerful generating asset that would quietly produce legitimate wealth for the people who actually deserved it. Mr. Gallagher assured me that the trust was wrapped in so much legal armor that not even the most aggressive corporate litigator could ever breach its walls. My life savings, which had almost vanished into the Cayman Islands, was now safely anchored in domestic accounts, protected by multiple layers of biometric security. The final piece of the architectural redesign involved securing the future leadership of my estate. I did not want to manage a boutique hotel or worry about corporate tax structures in my 70s. I looked at the paperwork naming the new executive trustees, and I smiled. I handed the absolute control of the irrevocable trust directly over to Melissa and James. They had proven their incredible loyalty and their brilliant courage under the most terrifying pressure imaginable. James had risked his own peace to warn me under the dinner table, and Melissa had found the strength to walk away from her toxic brother to protect her father. I signed the final transfer documents, effectively retiring from the corporate battlefield forever. I was giving them the keys to a massive financial legacy, not as a simple gift, but as a deeply earned reward for their unwavering integrity. Mr. Gallagher shook my hand warmly, congratulating me on building a legacy that would truly stand the test of time. I walked out of his office that morning feeling lighter than air, ready to finally begin the peaceful retirement I had originally planned. 6 months have passed since that chaotic night at the boutique hotel. The seasons have changed, and the warm breeze of early summer now sweeps through the old oak trees in my front yard. I am sitting in my favorite wooden rocking chair on the wraparound porch of my historic home. The very same home that my son tried to steal and leverage against his own greed is now completely safe and permanently protected by the ironclad trust. The sun is just beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow over the rose bushes my late wife planted so many years ago. It is Sunday evening again, but the atmosphere could not be more different from the tense and suffocating dinner that started this entire ordeal. There are no condescending lectures about my age, and there are no secret text messages warning me of impending ruin. There is only the comforting smell of roasted chicken drifting through the open kitchen window, and the sound of genuine laughter filling the spaces of this old house. Inside the house, Melissa and James are working together to set the dining room table. I watch them through the window, feeling a profound sense of gratitude swell in my chest. James, the quiet and unassuming son-in-law, who was always ignored in favor of my loud and arrogant son, proved to be the strongest steel beam in my entire family structure. When the pressure was absolute, he did not bend and he did not break. He stood beside me and helped me hold the roof up when the walls were violently collapsing. And Melissa has completely blossomed. Stripped of the toxic shadow her brother cast over her, she has become a fiercely independent and deeply loving woman. They are not just my family by marriage or by biological default anymore. They are my chosen family, bound to me by a crucible of fire and absolute loyalty. We sit down at the table together, passing plates of food and sharing stories about our week without a single trace of hidden agendas or calculated manipulations. As I listened to their voices, I realized the greatest lesson this entire nightmare has taught me. For 71 years, I believed that shared blood was the ultimate guarantee of love and respect. I believed that because I brought a son into this world and provided for him, he would naturally protect me when I grew old. But blood is nothing more than a simple biological coincidence. True family is a structure built entirely on mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and the daily choice to protect one another. When my biological son became a toxic flaw in that structure, I had to execute a silent adjustment. I had to realize that you cannot fix a foundation that is fundamentally corrupt. You have to be willing to tear down the rotten wood, no matter how much you used to love it, so you can preserve the integrity of the whole house. By removing Cameron from my life completely, I did not lose a son. I simply lost an illusion and gained absolute peace in return. After dinner, I walk back out onto the porch with a cup of warm tea. I look up at the clear night sky, feeling the quiet strength of the home surrounding me. The boutique hotel is currently being managed by a reputable hospitality firm, generating a steady income for the trust, and my life savings are securely untouched. Cameron is sitting in a federal prison cell, facing the harsh reality of his choices, and I am sitting here entirely free. If you are watching this and you have a family member who treats your love as a weakness or your resources as their personal right, I want you to remember my story. Never allow anyone to diminish your worth simply because you share the same last name. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, your dignity, and the life you have worked so hard to build. Do not be afraid to make your own silent adjustment. Sometimes the most beautiful and peaceful chapter of your life begins the exact moment you find the courage to walk away from the people who never truly valued you. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional surrender. We are taught to forgive our family, no matter what they do, but forgiveness without strict boundaries is simply an open invitation for further abuse. When someone clearly shows you that they view your lifelong sacrifices as a weakness, you must believe their actions and ignore their empty apologies. I survived this massive betrayal because I chose to think like an architect rather than a grieving father. I stopped weeping over the ashes of our relationship and started building an impenetrable fortress around my own future, realizing that true peace only arrives when you finally demand absolute respect. If my journey helped you realize your own worth, please hit the subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.